Hello class. As we move into part 2 of the course and into module 4, we're going to focus on the extraordinary personality of President Theodore Roosevelt, often known as TR, sometimes known as Teddy, although that was a name he particularly hated. The teddy bears that many of us had as kids were, of course, named after Theodore Roosevelt because of his great reputation as an outdoorsman. As you know, since you just watched the video, TR, an American Lion. If you haven't watched that video yet, please stop this and come back to it later and go watch the video first. You only need to watch the first hour and 15 minutes, but that video is going to cover Teddy Roosevelt's early life, and then there will be some discussion questions based on the video. In this brief lecture, we're going to focus on foreign policy, President Theodore Roosevelt's policy towards other nations as president. But first, how did Teddy Roosevelt become president? Well, in 1900, President McKinley ran again against William Jennings Bryan and won again. Bryan would run for a third time in the year 1908, and he would once again lose, making him one of only two men in American political history to run three times on a major party ticket and lose the White House three times. The other man was Henry Clay. But what was different about the 1900 election was that this time McKinley selected Theodore Roosevelt as his vice presidential running mate. And he did that kind of reluctantly. He didn't completely trust Roosevelt. He knew that Roosevelt had a very forceful personality, and McKinley considered him to be a loose cannon, someone that couldn't be controlled. However, Roosevelt's popularity as the hero of the Spanish-American War was so attractive to the Republicans that McKinley finally gave in and put Roosevelt on the ticket, and they won. However, McKinley's second term would not last very long, because in early September, McKinley was invited to speak at a gathering called the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. This was a kind of World's Fair event that focused specifically on business and commerce and trade between the U.S. and other countries. And Group 2, you've already had the speech that McKinley gave in Buffalo on September 6, 1901, when we discussed imperialism as your document. A few minutes after delivering the speech, McKinley left the podium, and he reached out his hand to a young man in the crowd to shake his hand, but the young man, Leon Czolgosz, pulled out a pistol and shot McKinley at point-blank range. Why did he do that? Well, Czolgosz was the son of Polish immigrants from Eastern Europe. He was also an anarchist. What's an anarchist? Well, that's a person who believes that there should be no government, that the world would be a better place if all governments were abolished. And there were many anarchists in Europe, and there were several assassinations of important political leaders at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Now, needless to say, the fact that Czolgosz was the son of immigrants and an anarchist did not really help the cause of immigrants in the United States. It cast a shadow once again over the patriotism and loyalty of immigrants. McKinley, at first, looked like he was going to survive. The wound would not be fatal, and in fact, he lingered on for 8 days with people expecting him to make a full recovery. However, McKinley finally died more because of the incompetence of his doctors than the actual gunshot. His wound became infected, and so McKinley passed away 8 days after the shooting. Czolgosz was arrested, and he became one of the first victims of the electric chair in New York State. The death of McKinley made Theodore Roosevelt president, of course, and that was distinctive because Roosevelt became the youngest man ever to serve in the White House. He was not the youngest man to be elected president. By the time of his reelection in 1904, Roosevelt was 46, meaning that the youngest man ever to be elected president was actually John F. Kennedy in 1960. But Roosevelt was the youngest man ever to serve as president of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt summed up his foreign policy in a very famous statement in 1901 when he said that his foreign policy would be to, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick, end quote. What did he mean by that? Well, speak softly suggests that he wanted to be diplomatic. He didn't want to be a bully and threaten other nations. However, the big stick represents the increasing military power of the United States, which other countries always knew was ready to be used in case they didn't go along with what President Roosevelt wanted. Now, I want to note at this point, Teddy Roosevelt was a very progressive man. He was a reformer. He cared deeply about workers. For example, he wanted to end child labor. Later, he said he wanted women to have the vote. But Teddy Roosevelt was also an imperialist. He wanted to expand American power overseas. And those two things really went hand in hand in the mind of Theodore Roosevelt, because the idea was that the white Anglo-American race was the master race, and it had an obligation, as we saw in the section on imperialism, to go forth and to civilize the rest of the world, and also to civilize and reform the habits of people within their own societies, okay, to make other people act more like white, well-educated Protestants were supposed to act. And it's interesting, this cartoon on the left here depicts how Roosevelt's imperialism and his ideas about reform were linked. You see here Teddy Roosevelt driving a wagon that's being pulled by the poor Republican elephant. The symbol of the GOP has always been an elephant. And he's driving the elephant along with his big stick. But the wagon has gotten bogged down because it's being weighed down by a bunch of kooks who are tagging along with the Republican Party. One of them, you see there, has a sign that says "No Race Suicide." And that reflects the idea that the white race in Europe and in America was committing suicide by not having enough babies, because it was well known that the birth rate for white women in America had been going down steadily and dramatically ever since the beginning of the 1800s, and white women were having many fewer babies on the average. However, non-white peoples in America and throughout the world continued to reproduce at a very healthy rate. And so there were white Americans, even many progressive Americans, were concerned that the white race was simply going to disappear and commit suicide. And that didn't make sense to them because these people were Darwinists. And according to the theory of Charles Darwin, of course, the master race should be the one to have the most babies, because it was better adapted to its environment and better adapted for survival. So, if you really believed that the white race was the master race, you wanted to promote reproduction among the white race to prove that this really was the superior race according to Darwinist principles. And this movement to try to increase the white race and decrease other races later became known as eugenics, and we'll take that up when I lecture on the 1920s. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's record on race was somewhat mixed, okay? For example, Teddy Roosevelt reached out to the great African-American leader Booker T. Washington who we'll talk about more in Module 5 in the lecture on Jim Crow. And he actually, early in his presidency, invited Washington to dine at the White House with his wife and his daughter, Alice. And that caused a furor, especially in Southern newspapers. People attacking Teddy Roosevelt for letting his wife and daughter eat with this black American. And it was a very brave thing for Teddy Roosevelt to do. So you see, there were times when Roosevelt showed himself to be very open to people of other races. On the other hand, his ideas about race suicide and trying to promote the interests of the white race throughout the world were also quite well known. Getting back to the foreign policy issues, one example of how Roosevelt used the big stick policy in Latin America had to do with the building of the Panama Canal, which was finished in the year 1914, largely because of the efforts of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, you have to understand that before the Panama Canal existed, if you wanted to sail a ship, let's say from Boston to China, you had to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. It was a very long and very dangerous voyage. And so the idea of building a Panama Canal was going to be a huge moneymaker for American business interests. It was going to cut shipping costs and promote commerce worldwide, especially for Americans. So Roosevelt was very enthusiastic about this. The problem was that at that time, Panama, the region of Panama, was actually owned by the South American country of Colombia. And Colombia said no to Teddy Roosevelt. They refused to allow the United States to build the canal. So what did Roosevelt do? Well, he began sending weapons and military advisors to help revolutionaries in Panama who wanted to break off from Colombia and establish their own nation. And so with the help of the United States military, the Panamanians did stage a successful revolution, did become an independent country, and very quickly they gave Roosevelt permission to build the Panama Canal for the United States. And so you see here an example of the big stick policy in action, using our military to achieve our foreign policy goals in Latin America. By the way, the Panama Canal was owned by the United States until the administration of President Jimmy Carter, and President Carter negotiated a treaty with Panama that returned the canal zone to the Panamanians. But that was only one of many times that Roosevelt intervened in Latin America. And he justified his actions by citing the Monroe Doctrine, which you'll recall was the statement of President James Monroe in 1825 saying that the U.S. had a special sphere of influence and responsibility in South and Central America. Roosevelt actually extended the Monroe Doctrine. He issued what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the doctrine. What TR said was that the United States had an international police power in Latin America. That is, we were empowered and authorized to use our military as a sort of police force to intervene whenever there were problems in any Latin American nation. And Roosevelt and his successor William Howard Taft intervened 12 times in different Latin American countries based on this idea, and many, many other U.S. presidents since then have also appealed to this principle to get involved in other nations like Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and many other places. Finally, I want to talk about U.S. relations with Japan under Teddy Roosevelt. In 1905, Japan went to war with Russia, and really Russia was considered to be a superpower. Most people at the time believed the Russians would just destroy the Japanese, but to the shock of the entire world, Japan actually wiped the floor with Russia in this very brief war, completely destroyed Russian resistance and won the Russo-Japanese War, showing that Japan was poised to become a rising superpower in the world. Well, at the end of the war, Teddy Roosevelt stepped in and volunteered to be the chief negotiator of a peace treaty between Russia and Japan, a treaty which, among other things, gave Japan control of Korea until after World War II. And for his efforts, somewhat ironically, Teddy Roosevelt became the first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. I say ironically because we think of Teddy Roosevelt as a warrior, and rightly so. But he also became famous as a peacemaker, ending this Russo-Japanese War. But the friendship between Roosevelt and Japan would be tested in 1907 because there were an increasing number of Japanese immigrants coming into this country, especially on the west coast of the United States. And the leaders of California considered these Japanese people to be non-white, to be an alien race. There was a lot of hostility to the Japanese, just as there had been for a long time to Chinese immigrants, as we've seen. And so in 1907, the state of California announced its plan to create segregated schools in which Japanese children would be taught in separate, segregated classrooms from white Anglo-American children. Now, this really infuriated the Japanese government, who felt they were entitled to some respect, after all, as an up-and-coming modern power, and they protested to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, of course, the President of the United States doesn't really have much power over what states do in terms of education, or at least at that time had very little power over education. It was considered to be a state matter completely. But Teddy leaned heavily on the leaders of California and finally cut a deal, essentially, between California and Japan. The Californians promised to end the segregation of the schools with respect to the Japanese, and the Japanese, in return, promised to cut off essentially all immigration from Japan to the United States. So this became known as the Gentleman's Agreement that was brokered by Teddy Roosevelt, once again showing, as we'll see in the next module, that Teddy Roosevelt was really pushing the envelope. He was really pushing the limits of presidential power, and he was willing to intervene and get involved in matters that no president prior to his time was willing to take on.